What started as a private legal dispute has now turned into a public unraveling that no one involved seems able to control anymore. And while most of the attention has focused on leaked messages and court filings, the deeper story is about how this situation quietly pulled in people who never asked to be part of it, and how that exposure has created real fallout behind the scenes. According to multiple accounts surrounding the dispute, the emotional impact hasn't been limited to one person. While the spotlight has been on Taylor Swift, sources describe Blake Lively as equally shaken by how personal details have spilled into public view. What was once a contained professional conflict has turned into something far more invasive, leaving both women dealing with embarrassment, stress, and the sudden realization that private conversations are now permanent public artifacts. At the same time, frustration has reportedly grown among people adjacent to the situation, particularly those with no legal involvement whatsoever. Travis Kelce, who is not a party to any lawsuit, has nonetheless found himself swept into the narrative simply by association. As online commentaries spilled over into his public platforms, the situation began affecting his professional image and personal life. Insiders describe a growing sense of disbelief among those close to him, centered on a simple question: why is this becoming everyone else's problem? That question seems to echo throughout Hollywood right now. There's a broader unease among industry figures who feel that proximity alone is enough to pull them into controversy. Several insiders describe the situation as a black hole, where even indirect connections risk unwanted scrutiny. As a result, people are growing cautious, limiting contact, and quietly distancing themselves, not out of disloyalty, but out of self-preservation. For Taylor Swift, this moment reportedly struck a particularly sensitive nerve. She has long been known for guarding her privacy intensely, and those close to her say the exposure of private messages has been deeply unsettling. Trust, according to insiders, has become a dominant concern, with her inner circle tightening as new legal documents continue to surface. Even those defending her privately acknowledge that the experience of having personal texts dissected publicly is distressing, regardless of context or intent. Blake Lively, meanwhile, is said to be grappling with a different kind of loss. Beyond legal stress, sources describe her as mourning the collapse of a once close friendship. The resurfacing of private messages has reportedly reopened emotional wounds, rather than offering any sense of closure. While some believe she hoped legal action might resolve lingering issues, the outcome appears to have done the opposite, reinforcing the finality of broken trust rather than repairing it. What's striking is the growing consensus, even among those sympathetic to her, that the lawsuit reignited attention that had largely faded. By the time legal filings became public interest had already moved on. The decision to pursue action brought everything back into focus, this time with far greater consequences and far less control over the narrative. And as this unfolds, the tension isn't just emotional, it's strategic. Industry observers note that once private disputes enter the legal system, they stop belonging to any one person. Timelines, messages, and internal disagreements become subject to interpretation, speculation, and judgment. At that point, intention matters less than perception, and perception can be brutal. This is the environment now surrounding the case: strained relationships, heightened paranoia, and a growing realization that no one emerges untouched once private conflicts become public theater. And for those watching closely, the question isn't just who's right or wrong, but how so many people ended up paying the price for a fight that may never have needed to happen at all. As the emotional fallout spread outward, the legal foundation of the case began raising difficult questions of its own. At the center of that scrutiny is the retaliation claim, which on paper sounds straightforward, but becomes increasingly complicated when placed on an actual timeline. Multiple legal observers have pointed out that the sequence of events simply doesn't align with how retaliation typically unfolds in the industry. Production on the film was interrupted by the industry strike, creating a long pause before filming resumed. When work restarted, Blake Lively reportedly declined to return to set unless a detailed list of conditions was formally agreed to. That list, initially longer, was eventually narrowed down and signed. What matters here is what came after. According to testimony from those present on set once filming resumed, no further incidents were reported. Cast and crew members stated that the remainder of production proceeded smoothly, without conflict or complaints. This creates a significant inconsistency. If retaliation was the motive, critics ask why it would allegedly occur months later, long after filming had resumed and issues had supposedly been resolved. Even more puzzling is the timing of the alleged smear effort, which is said to have emerged close to the film's release. From a business standpoint, damaging public perception at that stage would undercut the success of the very project everyone involved had a financial stake in protecting. Testimony from Blake Lively's representation further complicates the picture. Her agent confirmed under oath that after the agreed-upon conditions were signed and production resumed, there were no on-set problems. Conflict only reappeared later during post-production, specifically during the editing phase. That shift matters because it reframes the dispute from one centered on workplace conduct to one rooted in creative control. Behind the scenes, disagreements reportedly intensified over which version of the film would ultimately be released. Editing is where tone, pacing, and narrative intent are finalized, and those decisions carry enormous weight. According to deposition statements, this phase reopened tensions that had otherwise been dormant, suggesting the core dispute may have been less about behavior during filming and more about authority over the finished product. The professional consequences of this conflict are already visible. When asked whether Blake Lively's career had been affected, her own agent acknowledged a noticeable decline in interest from studios. While scripts may still circulate, he clarified that meaningful offers, projects with financing, distribution, and a clear path to production, have been largely absent. In industry terms, that distinction is critical. Interest without commitment doesn't translate into work. What makes this admission particularly striking is that it comes amid efforts that appeared aimed at sidelining others professionally. Instead, the backlash seems to have rebounded inward. Projects associated with key figures involved in the dispute have faced unexplained delays, muted promotional efforts, and sudden changes in release strategy. In Hollywood, those quiet shifts often signal reputational hesitation rather than creative reevaluation. Taken together, these details paint a picture far more complex than a single grievance. What began as a claim of mistreatment now intersects with questions about timing, motive, and professional fallout. The legal arguments may continue to evolve, but the record already shows a widening gap between the original narrative and the documented sequence of events. And it's within that gap, between what was alleged and what was later acknowledged, that the case becomes less about one incident and more about how power struggles, creative control, and public exposure collide once lawyers, studios, and reputations are all in play. The most revealing material, however, doesn't come from press leaks or anonymous insiders. It comes from inside the script itself. Studio notes on the screenplay offer a rare, unfiltered look at what the film was originally expected to be and how far it drifted during development. Internal feedback from Sony shows a consistent push in one direction. The studio wanted a more mature, grounded, and overtly romantic film. Repeated notes emphasized stillness over chatter, intimacy over irony, and emotional weight over comedic deflection. Again and again, executives flagged moments where dialogue undercut tension, where jokes disrupted intimacy, and where characters spoke when silence would have been more powerful. What's striking is how often those modes directly removed humor. Scenes that were meant to build sexual tension were stripped of punchlines. Romantic beats were rewritten to let body language carry meaning instead of banter. In multiple instances, the studio explicitly asked for less talking, fewer one-liners, and a more grown-up tone.
The message was consistent: stop interrupting intimacy with self-awareness. Several specific examples show this clearly. Jokes about body image, nervous rambling during romantic moments, and comedic callbacks were all crossed out. Studio feedback repeatedly questioned whether mainstream audiences would even understand the humor, suggesting that the jokes weren't just misplaced emotionally, but confusing narratively. The concern wasn't offensiveness, it was dilution. Most notably, the studio repeatedly asked for the intimate scenes to be hotter, not tamer. Notes encouraged clearer physical choreography, stronger visual storytelling, and wardrobe choices that supported sexual tension. Executives questioned whether the scenes were being staged in a way that actually sold romance on screen, emphasizing that intimacy requires intentional design, not avoidance. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Many of the same elements later cited as distressing or inappropriate were at the time being encouraged by the studio itself. The push for more heat, more physicality, and more adult romance wasn't coming from a rogue director, it was documented studio feedback. And that feedback was often resisted, rewritten, or softened through added humor and deflection. The notes also reveal frustration with a recurring tonal problem. Moments that should have been emotionally sincere were repeatedly undercut by awkwardness. Executives compared certain character beats to performances known for comedic insecurity, expressing concern that the male lead was being reshaped into something less confident, less romantic, and less aligned with the story's intent. Even classic romantic tropes were deliberately avoided at the studio's request. Familiar jokes lifted from iconic films were crossed out, with notes urging originality and restraint. The goal was clear: create a timeless, emotionally immersive romance, not a self-referential parody of one. Taken together, these notes don't just offer creative insight, they function as a paper trail. They show what was asked for, what was resisted, and where creative disagreements actually lived. And those disagreements weren't centered on safety or boundaries, they were centered on tone, maturity, and control over how intimacy was portrayed on screen. By the time the film reached the public, the legal battle had reframed these creative conflicts as something else entirely. But the documents tell a quieter, more precise story of a project caught between opposing visions, where intimacy became a battleground not because it existed, but because of how it was handled. And once those internal contradictions surfaced, the narrative stopped being just about personal grievances. It became about whether the claims being made publicly could withstand comparison with what was happening privately, line by line, note by note, long before any lawsuit was ever filed.